In a city where power rules and secrets destroy, one woman's life is shattered by betrayal. Leona Carter, a rising star in the corporate world, finds herself blacklisted and abandoned after a secret affair with her powerful boss, Edward Sterling. Left to raise her son alone, Leona fights against insurmountable odds to give him a better future. But when her son, Elijah, unknowingly steps into the shadow of the man who destroyed their lives, buried truths resurface. As past and present collide, courage and resilience will be tested in a battle for justice that could change everything. But before diving, let me know where you're watching from. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because we'll be bringing you more amazing gift tomorrow. Now let's start this journey together. The sky outside the towering glass building of Summit Strategies was painted in hues of fading orange and deep blue as the day gave way to night. Inside, the office lights cast a sterile glow over rows of empty desks and cubicles. Everyone had long gone home, except for Leona Carter, a brilliant and hard-working senior analyst whose determination had earned her respect and envy in equal measure. Leona sat at her desk, typing furiously on her laptop, a few errant curls escaping from her tightly pinned hair. The soft click of keys was interrupted by the low hum of a voice from the corner office. She glanced up and saw Edward Sterling, the charismatic CEO, leaning over his desk, phone in hand. His presence was commanding, even in the quiet stillness of the office. For months, their paths had crossed in the solitude of late-night work sessions. Leona had admired Edward's vision and drive, while he had been drawn to her sharp mind and unwavering dedication. Their shared hours gradually dissolved professional boundaries, giving way to quiet conversations, fleeting glances, and moments that felt far more intimate than they should have been. Tonight was different. Leona hesitated in the hallway, a folder clutched tightly in her hands. She had replayed this moment in her mind 1,000 times, but now that it was here, her confidence faltered. Finally, summoning her courage, she stepped into Edward's office. "Leona," Edward greeted, glancing up briefly before returning his attention to the stack of papers before him. "What brings you here this late?" "I need to talk to you," she began, her voice steadier than she felt. Edward gestured to the chair across from him, without looking up. "Go ahead." She remained standing, gripping the back of the chair for support. "It's personal." The comment drew his full attention. He set his pen down and leaned back, his sharp gray eyes studying her. "What's on your mind?" Leona took a deep breath, her knuckles whitening as she gripped the chair. "I'm pregnant, Edward." The air in the room grew heavy, the silence pressing down like a physical weight. Edward blinked, his expression carefully neutral. "I see," he said finally. "It's yours," she added, her voice trembling despite her effort to remain composed. He exhaled slowly, rising from his chair and walking toward the window. The city lights glittered below, a vast and indifferent sea of activity. For a moment, he said nothing, and the quiet stretched into something almost unbearable. "This is unfortunate," Edward said at last, his voice calm but cold. Leona stared at him, her heart pounding. "Unfortunate," she repeated, the word tasting bitter on her tongue. "Is that all you have to say?" "What do you expect me to say, Leona?" he replied, turning to face her. His expression was unreadable, his tone clipped. "You should have been more careful." "We were careful," she shot back, her frustration bubbling to the surface. "Clearly not careful enough," he retorted, crossing his arms. "And now you're telling me, because you want me to do something about it?" Leona's grip tightened on the chair. "I thought you'd want to take responsibility," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor threatening to break through. "I thought we could figure this out together." Edward's eyes narrowed, and his voice dropped to a chilling calm. "Figure this out?" "Leona, let's be honest. You knew what this was." Her breath hitched as the weight of his words hit her. "What do you mean?" He sighed, his gaze unwavering. "We're adults. We had something casual and understanding. I never promised you anything more." Leona felt the floor beneath her tilt. Every stolen moment, every whispered word, every lingering glance, it had all felt so real. Yet here he stood, stripping it down to nothing more than a convenient dalliance. I'm keeping the baby, she said, her voice firm despite the tears stinging her eyes. Edward tilted his head, his expression hardening. That's your choice, of course, but don't expect me to be involved. She took a step closer, her voice rising with a mix of anger and despair. You can't just walk away from this, Edward. This is your child, too. His jaw tightened, and his tone turned menacingly low. Leona, I'm warning you, drop this. For your sake. For my sake, she echoed, incredulous. You're the one abandoning your responsibilities. Edward returned to his desk, his movements deliberate. This conversation ends now, he said coldly. As of today, so does your employment here. Her breath caught in her throat. You're firing me? Because I'm pregnant? No, he replied, his tone businesslike. I'm ensuring there's no unnecessary drama. You'll receive a generous severance package, and this can all remain private. Leona's chest tightened, her voice cracking. I gave years to this company. I worked harder than anyone, and this is how you repay me? This is about protecting my family and my reputation, he said, sitting back down and picking up his pen. You should protect yourself, too. The words were like a slap, and for a moment, she couldn't breathe. She stared at him, searching for a trace of the man she thought she knew, but there was nothing but a cold, calculating stranger. Without another word, Leona turned and walked out, her heart breaking with each step. Back at her desk, Leona's hands shook as she packed her belongings into a small cardboard box. The office she had poured her life into felt alien, every corner a reminder of dreams that now felt shattered. As she stepped into the elevator, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the polished doors. Tears streamed down her face, but behind them was a flicker of resolve. She placed a hand over her stomach and whispered, "We'll get through this. I don't know how, but we will." Outside, the city buzzed with life, indifferent to her pain. But as Leona walked away from the towering building of Summit Strategies, she realized she wasn't walking away empty-handed. She carried with her the promise of a new beginning, a child who would become her reason to keep fighting. The cold autumn wind whipped through the streets of Chicago as Leona Carter stepped off the bus, clutching a grocery bag filled with necessities she could barely afford. The towering buildings that once symbolized her ambition now felt like monuments to a world that had shut her out. It had been 3 months since she left Summit Strategies, not by choice but by Edward Sterling's ruthless hand. The severance package she received had barely covered her rent, and finding new work in her field proved impossible. No one said it outright, but Leona knew the truth. She had been blacklisted. Every interview she attended ended in vague excuses. "We're going in a different direction," or "Your experience is impressive, but we've chosen another candidate." The rejection letters piled up, each one chipping away at her confidence. At night, as she lay on the worn-out couch in her modest apartment, she would stare at the ceiling, her mind racing with questions she couldn't answer. How would she provide for her baby? What kind of life could she offer this child when her own prospects were so bleak? Her closest friends had tried to help, but their resources were limited, and sympathy didn't pay the bills. Leona's pride prevented her from sharing the full extent of her struggles, even with those she trusted most. Instead, she resolved to find another way. One morning, after yet another fruitless job search, Leona caught her reflection in a shop window. She looked weary, her once bright eyes dulled by exhaustion. But beneath the fatigue, there was still a glimmer of determination. She straightened her shoulders and whispered to herself, "This isn't the end. You've faced worse." Leona took a series of odd jobs to make ends meet. She worked long hours as a cashier at a local market, spending her evenings cleaning offices downtown. On weekends, she sewed and repaired clothing for neighbors, turning her tiny apartment into a makeshift tailor shop. Though the work was grueling, she found solace in the small victories. Paying the electric bill on time, affording fresh fruit for the first time in weeks, and feeling her baby kick for the first time as she sat on the bus ride home. Despite her circumstances, Leona began preparing for motherhood with the same focus she had once devoted to her career. She read every book she could find on parenting, attended free prenatal classes, and saved every penny to create a warm, safe space for her child. When her son, Elijah, was born on a chilly January morning. Leona felt a sense of purpose she hadn't known she was capable of. Holding him for the first time, she whispered, "You are my reason to keep going." Motherhood transformed Leona. Her love for Elijah became a wellspring of strength, pushing her to endure long nights and exhausting days. She was determined to raise him with dignity, even when her own life felt like a series of uphill battles. As Elijah grew, so did the challenges. Their apartment was small, and the neighborhood wasn't always safe. But Leona did everything in her power to shield him from the harshness of their reality. She worked overtime to afford books and learning games, transforming their living room into a space of creativity and discovery. Leona's sacrifices were endless. She skipped meals so Elijah could have enough to eat, walked miles to save on bus fare, and went years without buying herself new clothes. Yet she never let him see her despair. Instead, she taught him resilience, reminding him daily, no matter how hard things get you, keep going. You're stronger than the world around you. Her unwavering love and determination shaped Elijah into a thoughtful, driven boy who carried himself with quiet confidence. He excelled in school, often staying late to help younger students or organize book drives for his classmates. By the time Elijah reached high school, his potential was undeniable. Teachers often marveled at his work ethic and leadership skills, urging him to aim high. Leona, despite her weariness, found pride swelling in her chest whenever she heard his name called at honor roll ceremonies or saw him lead the debate team to victory. One evening, as they sat together at their tiny kitchen table, Elijah looked up from his homework. "Mom, do you ever regret everything you gave up for me?" he asked softly, his eyes searching hers. Leona paused, setting down her cup of tea. "Never," she said firmly. "You are my greatest achievement, Elijah. All I want is for you to have the opportunities one didn't, and I know you'll make the most of them." Encouraged by his mother's belief in him, Elijah threw himself into his studies with even greater determination. He spent weekends volunteering at local shelters and evenings, preparing for college applications. Despite their limited resources, Leona found ways to support him, even if it meant taking on extra shifts to pay for college prep courses. During his senior year, Elijah earned an internship at Bright Horizons Consulting, a prestigious firm in downtown Chicago. The opportunity was a turning point, offering him a glimpse into the professional world he had always dreamed of entering. On his first day, as he stood outside the sleek glass building, Elijah adjusted his tie and took a deep breath. "I'm doing this for us, Mom," he whispered to himself before stepping inside. At home, Leona sat by the window, waiting for his call. When her phone buzzed, she answered eagerly, and his voice spilled through the line, filled with excitement and gratitude. "Mom, it's amazing," Elijah said. "I can't believe I'm here." Leona smiled, tears brimming in her eyes. "I knew you'd make it, Elijah. This is just the beginning." As the years passed, Elijah's star continued to rise. He graduated with honors, securing a full scholarship to a prestigious university. Through it all, Leona remained his anchor, her quiet strength and boundless love guiding him through every challenge. Though life had never been easy, the bond between them was unbreakable. Together, they had faced rejection, poverty, and uncertainty, emerging stronger than ever. Leona often reflected on her journey, marveling at how far they had come. The struggles she had endured now felt like stepping stones, each one leading to the life she had built for her son. And while the pain of Edward's betrayal still lingered in the quiet corners of her heart, it no longer defined her. Instead, she defined herself by her triumphs, her love, and the legacy she had created through Elijah, a legacy of resilience, hope, and the unwavering belief that no obstacle was insurmountable. The summer morning was unusually bright, the sunlight bouncing off the towering glass building of Summit Strategies, one of the most prestigious firms in the city. Standing at the entrance, Elijah Carter adjusted his tie and took a deep breath. This was the moment he had worked so hard for, a chance to prove himself in the corporate world. He clutched his briefcase tightly, the weight of his dreams and his mother's sacrifices pressing against him. Leona had always been his rock, her resilience shaping him into the ambitious young man he had become. As he stepped through the revolving doors, he couldn't help but think of her words the night before. Stay sharp, Elijah. Not everything is as it seems, and not everyone will have your best interests at heart. Elijah's journey to Summit Strategies had been anything but easy. After excelling in college, he had faced fierce competition for a spot at the firm. When he received the offer letter, he had been overjoyed, calling his mother immediately to share the news. I got it, Mom. I'm officially an associate at Summit Strategies. Leona's voice on the other end was filled with pride, but there was a pause before she spoke again. Summit Strategies, she repeated slowly. I've heard of them. They're big players, but what? Elijah had asked, confused by her hesitation. I just want you to be careful, she said finally. You never know what kind of people are at the top of a company like that. Elijah brushed off her concerns, attributing them to her protective nature. Summit Strategies was a stepping stone to everything he had dreamed of, a stable career, financial independence, and a chance to make his mark. As Elijah stepped off the elevator onto the 30th floor, he was greeted by sleek, modern decor and the buzz of activity. Employees moved purposefully between glass-walled offices, their voices low but efficient. Mr. Carter? A voice interrupted his thoughts. Turning, Elijah saw a sharply dressed woman with a no-nonsense expression. I'm Melissa Tate, your supervisor. Welcome aboard. Thank you, Ms. Tate, Elijah said, offering a polite smile. Follow me. We'll get you settled, she said, leading him through the labyrinth of desks and meeting rooms. Elijah soaked in his surroundings, impressed by the energy of the place. This was exactly where he belonged, he thought. As they passed by the executive offices, Melissa slowed, briefly, gesturing toward a corner suite with floor-to-ceiling windows. That's Mr. Sterling's office, she said. Mr. Sterling? Elijah asked. Edward Sterling, the CEO, Melissa clarified. He built this company from the ground up, tough as nails but brilliant. If you catch his attention, you're doing something right. Elijah nodded, filing away the information. He hoped one day to earn the kind of respect that came with a reputation like Sterling's. Later that morning, Elijah was reviewing files at his new desk when he felt a shift in the room's energy. Glancing up, he saw a tall, silver-haired man striding through the office. Edward Sterling. The CEO's presence commanded attention, his tailored suit and confident demeanor leaving no doubt about who held the power in the building. Elijah straightened in his seat, trying not to stare as Sterling stopped to speak with a group of senior executives. Then it happened. Sterling's eyes drifted across the room and landed on Elijah. For a brief moment, their gazes locked. Sterling's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, something Elijah couldn't quite place. Elijah looked away, pretending to focus on his work, but he could still feel the weight of Sterling's gaze. When he glanced up again, Sterling had turned back to his conversation, his expression as impassive as ever. That evening, as Elijah walked into the small apartment he still shared with his mother, he found her in the kitchen, stirring a pot of stew. The aroma of simmering vegetables and spices filled the air, a comforting reminder of home. How was it? Leona asked, glancing up from the stove. It was great, Elijah said, setting down his briefcase. The place is impressive, Mom. I can't believe I'm really there. Leona smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. I'm glad to hear that. Elijah hesitated, sensing her unease. Mom, is something wrong? Leona set down her spoon and turned to face him. It's just that company. I don't know why, but it makes me nervous. Nervous? Why? Leona shook her head, her expression troubled. I can't explain it. Just promise me you'll keep your guard up, Elijah. Don't get too comfortable. Elijah frowned, confused by her reaction. Mom, this is what we've worked for. I'm not going to let anything mess it up. I know, she said softly. But sometimes, the past has a way of catching up when you least expect it. Her words lingered in Elijah's mind long after they finished dinner. What past was she talking about? Meanwhile, in his spacious corner office, Edward Sterling leaned back in his chair, staring out at the city skyline. His mind replayed the brief encounter with Elijah earlier that day. There was something about the young man, something familiar. His name, Carter, struck a chord, though Sterling couldn't immediately place why. He opened a file on his desk, flipping through employee records until he found Elijah's profile. His academic achievements were impressive, and his references glowing. But it was the name Carter that continued to nag at him, pulling at a memory he couldn't quite grasp. Sterling closed the file, shaking his head. Perhaps it was just a coincidence. After all, he had met countless people over the years. Still, a sliver of doubt lingered, planting itself firmly in the back of his mind. For Elijah, the first few weeks at Summit Strategies were a whirlwind of deadlines, presentations, and late nights. He thrived under the pressure, impressing Melissa and his colleagues with his ability to adapt and perform. But there were moments when he felt an unshakable unease, particularly whenever he crossed paths with Sterling. Though the CEO remained professional, there was always a faint tension in his gaze, as if he were piecing together a puzzle. At home, Leona noticed the exhaustion in Elijah's face, but chose not to press him. Instead, she supported him in quiet ways, leaving late-night snacks on the table or offering words of encouragement when he seemed overwhelmed. "I'll be fine, Mom," Elijah assured her one night. "This is what I've been working for. I just need to prove myself." Leona nodded, her heart heavy with unspoken fears. She had worked too hard to protect him from the shadows of her past, but now those shadows felt closer than ever. The sound of rain drummed softly against the windows as Elijah sat in the small living room of his apartment. It had been a long week, but he couldn't ignore the unease that had settled in his chest. His mother, Leona, was unusually quiet, her gaze distant as she folded laundry on the couch. "Mom," Elijah began hesitantly, breaking the silence. "Can I ask you something?" Leona looked up, her hands stilling for a moment. "Of course, sweetheart. What's on your mind?" He hesitated, unsure how to phrase his thoughts. "It's about the company, Summit Strategies." Her shoulders tensed almost imperceptibly, but she quickly recovered, offering him a cautious smile. "What about it? Do you know something about them?" he asked, watching her carefully. "You've seemed uneasy ever since I started working there." Leona sighed, setting down the shirt she had been folding. She knew this moment would come, but it didn't make it any easier. "Elijah, there's something I should have told you a long time ago. Something I've kept from you, because I thought it would protect you." His brow furrowed, concern etched across his face. "What is it, Mom?" She took a deep breath, her voice trembling slightly as she spoke. "Edward Sterling, the CEO of Summit Strategies, he's your father." The words hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and unrelenting. Elijah stared at his mother, disbelief and confusion battling for dominance in his mind. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Leona's eyes glistened with unshed tears as she began to recount the story she had buried for years. "When I was younger, I worked for him," she said. "I was ambitious, like you, and determined to make a name for myself in the corporate world. Edward noticed my work, and we grew close. I thought he cared about me." Her voice cracked, and she paused to collect herself. "But when I told him I was pregnant, everything changed. He refused to take responsibility and fired me to protect his reputation. Worse than that, he made sure I couldn't find work in the industry again. He destroyed everything I had built, all to cover his tracks." Elijah's fists clenched as anger surged through him. "And you never told me?" "Not once. I wanted to spare you from the pain," Leona said softly. "I didn't want you to grow up knowing the kind of man he is. I thought it was better to leave the past behind and focus on building a life for us." Elijah stood abruptly, pacing the room as his mind raced. "All this time, I looked up to him. I admired him. And he's the reason you struggled so much? The reason we had nothing?" Leona nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry, Elijah. I thought I was doing the right thing." He stopped pacing and turned to her, his eyes blazing with determination. "He needs to know, Mom. He needs to answer for what he did." The following evening, Elijah stood outside an upscale restaurant in the heart of the city. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets glistening under the soft glow of streetlights. He had overheard colleagues mention that Edward Sterling often dined here with his family. And sure enough, through the large glass windows, he spotted the man sitting at a corner table with his wife and son. Elijah's heart pounded as he walked through the revolving door. The hostess greeted him with a warm smile, but he barely registered her words. His focus was on the man who had turned his mother's life upside down. As he approached the table, the quiet hum of the restaurant seemed to fade. Edward looked up, his expression calm at first, but it quickly shifted when he recognized Elijah. "Elijah," Edward said, his tone measured but wary. "What are you doing here?" Elijah ignored the question, his voice steady but laced with anger. "We need to talk." Edward's wife, Isabel, looked between them, her brow furrowing. "Do you know him, Edward?" "From the office," Edward replied quickly, his voice tight. "He's one of our associates." "Not just from the office," Elijah said sharply. "I'm also your son." Isabel's fork clattered onto her plate, her face paling as she turned to her husband. "What is he talking about, Edward?" Edward's son, Colin, stared at Elijah in shock, his confusion mirrored in his mother's eyes. "Don't listen to this," Edward said, his voice rising slightly. "This isn't the time or place for whatever this is." But Elijah wasn't backing down. "You don't get to dismiss me, not this time. You left my mother with nothing, forced her out of the industry, and let us struggle while you lived your perfect life." The tension at the table was palpable, the murmurs of nearby diners beginning to ripple through the room. Isabel's hands shook as she placed them on the table, her voice trembling. "Edward, is this true?" Edward's jaw tightened, his carefully curated composure beginning to crack. "Isabel, please, we can discuss this later." "No," Elijah interjected, his voice firm. "You'll discuss it now. You owe her that much." Isabel's eyes filled with tears as she stared at her husband. "You have another child? You did this to someone, and you never told me?" Edward's silence was damning. Colin pushed back his chair, standing abruptly. "Is this some kind of joke? Dad, tell us it's not true." But Edward couldn't deny it any longer. His shoulders slumped as he muttered, "It was a long time ago. A mistake." Elijah's anger flared. A mistake? Destroying her life was a mistake? Blacklisting her, making sure she couldn't work, forcing her to raise me alone. Was that just a mistake to you? The restaurant was silent now, all eyes on the unfolding scene. Isabel stood, her voice shaking with rage. "You lied to me for all these years. Who else have you lied to, Edward? How many other lives have you ruined?" Edward reached for her hand, but she pulled away. "Isabel, please." "No," she said firmly, her tears now replaced by cold fury. "You don't get to ask for forgiveness. Not after this." Elijah stepped closer, his voice low but cutting. "You took everything from her, and you think you can just live your life like nothing happened. But the truth has a way of catching up to people like you." Edward's face was ashen, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. For the first time, he looked truly defeated. Elijah turned and walked out of the restaurant, his heart pounding with a mix of anger and vindication. The cool night air hit him like a bomb, washing away the tension of the confrontation. Back at the apartment, Leona was waiting for him, her hands clenched tightly as she paced the room. When Elijah walked in, her eyes searched his face for answers. "I told him," Elijah said simply. "I told him everything." Leona's shoulders sagged with relief, but her voice was heavy. "And he knows he can't hide anymore," Elijah replied. "I don't know what happens next, but I know this. He'll never forget what he did to us." Leona stepped forward, pulling him into a tight embrace. "You're brave, Elijah," she whispered. "Braver than I ever was." Elijah held her close, the storm in his heart finally beginning to calm. "We don't need him, Mom. We never did. But now he knows the truth. That's enough." And as the rain began to fall again outside, they stood together in the quiet strength of their bond, ready to face whatever came next. The sun was barely rising over the city when Edward Sterling stepped into his home office. The events of the previous night replayed in his mind, each word from Elijah a dagger he couldn't pull free. The house, usually quiet in the early hours, felt oppressively silent now, as though even the walls judged him. The confrontation at the restaurant had shattered the illusion of control he'd carefully maintained for decades. Isabel's tear-streaked face, Colin's look of betrayal, and Elijah's cutting words, they haunted him, pressing against his chest like an iron weight. Edward sat heavily at his desk, his hands trembling as he opened his laptop. His inbox was already flooded with messages, concerned emails from board members, reporters asking for comments, and whispers of dissent from within the company. The scandal was spreading like wildfire. In the kitchen, Isabel Sterling stood at the counter, her hands gripping the edge as she stared blankly out the window. The smell of coffee lingered in the air, untouched in the cup she had poured. Colin sat at the table, his face hard with anger. "When were you going to tell us, Dad?" Colin demanded when Edward finally joined them, his tone sharper than Edward had ever heard. Edward paused in the doorway, his shoulders slumped. "I didn't think it would ever come to this," he said, his voice barely audible. "That's not an answer," Colin shot back. "You had a son, another family, and you hid it from us like some dirty secret. What else aren't you telling us?" Isabel turned slowly, her eyes red and swollen. "I spent 24 years of my life believing in you, Edward," she said, her voice trembling with controlled fury. "I trusted you with everything. And now, I don't even know who you are." "I didn't want to hurt anyone," Edward said, his voice defensive. "I thought I could handle it. Keep it separate." Isabel let out a bitter laugh, her tears finally spilling over. "Separate? You destroyed that boy's mother, Edward. You destroyed their lives. And for what? Your reputation? Your precious company?" Colin stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I can't do this," he said, grabbing his keys. "I need to clear my head." "Colin," Edward began, but his son was already out the door. By mid-morning, Edward was back in his office at Summit Strategies, facing the growing storm from his executive team. The boardroom was tense, the air thick with the unspoken tension of a brewing coup. "I think we can all agree that the situation is delicate," said Graham Ellis, the CFO, his tone carefully neutral, but his eyes sharp. "Delicate?" snapped one of the directors. "This is a PR nightmare. The press is already running stories and clients are asking questions. If we don't act quickly, we'll lose more than just our reputation." Edward sat at the head of the table, his hands clasped tightly together. He had always been the master of this room, his decisions rarely questioned. But now, he was no longer the unshakable force he once was. "We need to issue a statement," Edward said, his voice firm despite the weight in his chest. "Take control of the narrative before it spirals further." Graham exchanged a glance with another board member before clearing his throat. "Edward, perhaps it's time to consider stepping back." Edward froze, the words hitting him like a physical blow. "Stepping back," he repeated, his tone low and dangerous. "For the good of the company," Graham added cautiously. "The board believes that your continued presence could do more harm than good." The silence in the room was deafening. Edward's mind raced, but he knew the truth. The empire he had spent decades building was slipping through his fingers. That evening, Isabel found Edward sitting alone in his home office, the dim light casting long shadows across his face. The once confident man now looked smaller, his shoulders hunched and his gaze distant. "What are you going to do?" Isabel asked, her voice void of the warmth it once held. Edward didn't look up. "They want me to step down?" Isabel folded her arms, leaning against the doorframe. "Maybe you should. You've already lost this family. Do you really want to lose the company too?" He flinched at her words, but didn't respond. "I'm leaving," she said after a long pause. Edward's head snapped up. "Isabel, wait." "No," she interrupted, her voice firm. "I've waited long enough. I need time to figure out who I am outside of being your wife, because right now I don't recognize the man I married." She turned and walked away, leaving Edward alone in the suffocating silence of his regrets. The next morning, Summit Strategies issued a press release announcing Edward's resignation. It was carefully worded to frame the decision as mutual, emphasizing his desire to focus on personal matters. But everyone inside the company knew the truth. Edward cleaned out his office in silence, the once bustling floor outside his glass walls unusually subdued. Employees avoided his gaze as he passed, their hushed whispers following him to the elevator. As the doors closed, Edward stared at his reflection, the polished surface revealing a man who had lost everything. The weight of his choices pressed heavily on him, and for the first time in years, he felt truly powerless. Across town, Elijah sat on a park bench, scrolling through his phone. The headlines were everywhere. Corporate giant Edward Sterling steps down amid scandal. Hidden past unveiled. The fall of Summit Strategies CEO. He felt a strange mix of emotions, vindication, anger, and an odd sense of emptiness. The man who had once seemed untouchable was finally facing the consequences of his actions. But it didn't erase the years of struggle his mother had endured. Leona joined him, handing him a cup of coffee as she sat beside him. "It's all over the news," she said softly. Elijah nodded. "I saw. How do you feel?" she asked. He took a sip of his coffee, staring at the horizon. "I thought it would feel better, like I'd finally have closure. But now, I don't know." Leona placed a hand on his shoulder. "Closure doesn't always come from seeing someone else fall, Elijah. It comes from knowing you did what was right and moving forward with your life." Elijah turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "Do you think he regrets it? Everything he did to you?" Leona smiled faintly, her eyes filled with quiet strength. "Regret won't change the past, but we can't let his choices define us anymore. We've come too far for that." For Edward, the days following his resignation were a blur of isolation and reflection. Isabel filed for divorce, taking Colin with her to stay with family. The sprawling house that once buzzed with life now echoed with emptiness. For Elijah and Leona, life carried on. Elijah continued to excel at Summit Strategies, determined to rise on his own merits. Though the company was tainted by scandal, Elijah saw it as an opportunity to rebuild its reputation from within. One evening, as he sat with his mother, Elijah said, "We've come a long way, haven't we?" Leona smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "Yes, we have, and there's still so much ahead." They clinked their glasses together, a quiet toast to resilience, redemption, and the unshakable bond that had carried them through the storm. The morning sun streamed through the curtains of the small apartment, casting a warm glow across the kitchen table where Leona Carter and her son Elijah sat. The air smelled of freshly brewed coffee, and the quiet hum of the radio filled the room. For the first time in days, the atmosphere felt calm, almost peaceful. Elijah stirred his coffee absently, his thoughts distant. The events of the past weeks had left an indelible mark on him. Exposing Edward Sterling, his estranged father, had brought an end to decades of secrets, but the emotional toll lingered like a heavy weight on his chest. Leona broke the silence, her voice gentle yet firm. "You've been quiet, Elijah. What's on your mind?" He sighed, setting down his spoon and meeting her eyes. "I don't know, Mom. I guess I'm just trying to figure out what happens next." Her brow furrowed slightly, and she reached across the table to place a hand on his. "You've already done the hardest part. You stood up for what was right, and you made sure he couldn't hide from the truth anymore. But did it even matter?" Elijah asked, his voice tinged with frustration. Edward lost his position. "Sure, but it doesn't change what he did to you. It doesn't erase the years we struggled or make up for the pain he caused." Leona's gaze softened, and a small smile tugged at the corners of her lips. "Justice isn't always about punishment, Elijah. Sometimes it's about survival, about proving that no matter what someone else takes from you, they can't break you." Leona leaned back in her chair, her hands wrapping around her coffee mug. "Do you know what I thought about during the hardest times?" she asked. Elijah shook his head, genuinely curious. "You," she said simply. "Every long shift, every rejection, every night I went to bed wondering how we'd make it to the next day, I thought about you, about your future. That's what kept me going." Elijah felt a lump rise in his throat. He had always known his mother was strong, but hearing her speak so openly about their struggles made him appreciate her sacrifices even more. "You're my justice," she continued. "The fact that we're here, sitting at this table, with you thriving despite everything he tried to take from us, that's all the justice I need." Elijah's shoulders relaxed, her words sinking in. "You're right," he said after a moment. "We've come so far, and I don't want to waste any more energy on him." He doesn't deserve it. Leona nodded, her smile widening. That's my boy. That afternoon, Elijah sat at his desk in the corner of their living room. A fresh notebook opened before him. He scribbled down ideas, crossing some out and circling others. Leona walked by and peeked over his shoulder. What's all this? She asked, curiosity lacing her voice. I've been thinking, he replied, tapping his pen against the page. I don't want to stay at Summit Strategies. Leona raised an eyebrow. I thought you loved it there. I did, he admitted. But now, knowing everything about Edward and how he built the company, it doesn't feel right. I want to build something of my own, something that doesn't carry a shadow. Leona nodded thoughtfully. That's a big decision, Elijah, but I think it's the right one. He grinned at her, the first genuine smile she had seen in days. I was thinking about starting my own consulting firm. Nothing big at first, just a small operation focused on helping nonprofits and small businesses. It's something that feels meaningful, you. No. Leona's eyes lit up with pride. That sounds perfect, Elijah. You've always had a heart for helping others. Over the next few weeks, Elijah threw himself into planning his new venture. He spent hours researching, writing business plans, and reaching out to contacts he had made during his time at Summit Strategies. Leona, ever his biggest supporter, helped in any way she could. She reviewed documents, offered advice, and even helped him design a logo. Their tiny apartment buzzed with activity, the energy of a fresh start filling the air. One evening, as they worked late into the night, Elijah paused and looked at his mother. I couldn't have done any of this without you, Mom. Everything I am, everything I've accomplished. It's because of you. Leona's eyes filled with tears, and she reached out to squeeze his hand. You've always had it in you, Elijah. I just gave you a little push. On a crisp fall morning, Elijah stood outside a small office space he had rented in the heart of the city. The sign on the door read, Carter Consulting. It wasn't much, a modest room with a desk and a few chairs, but to Elijah, it was everything. Leona stood beside him, her arm linked with his. It's beautiful, she said, her voice brimming with emotion. It's a start, Elijah replied, unlocking the door and stepping inside. As he looked around the space, he felt a sense of pride and possibility he hadn't known before. This was his, built not from the ashes of Edward's mistakes, but from the strength and resilience his mother had instilled in him. Meanwhile, Edward Sterling sat alone in the empty mansion that had once been a symbol of his success. Isabel and Colin had left weeks ago, and the silence was deafening. For the first time in his life, Edward had no one to blame but himself. He thought about reaching out to Elijah, but each time he picked up the phone, shame stopped him. What could he say that would make a difference? He had spent years pretending they didn't exist, and now the consequences of his actions were impossible to ignore. For Elijah, however, Edward's regret no longer mattered. He had moved on, choosing to focus on the life he was building instead of the man who had tried to cast a shadow over it. Months later, Carter Consulting was thriving. Elijah had secured several clients, and word of his dedication and integrity was spreading. Leona often visited the office, bringing lunch and offering encouragement. One afternoon, as they sat together reviewing a proposal, Leona looked at Elijah and said, You've done it, you know. You've created something that's entirely yours. Elijah smiled, a sense of peace settling over him. We done it, Mom. I couldn't have done any of this without you. Leona shook her head. No, Elijah. This is your legacy, and it's just the beginning. As they sat together in the warm glow of the office, the weight of the past finally lifted. Their journey had been long and filled with challenges, but they had risen above the shadows, stronger than ever. Together, they had proven that resilience, love, and determination could overcome even the darkest of times. The city bustled outside the windows of Carter Consulting, the soft hum of life carrying on as usual. Inside the modest office, Elijah Carter sat at his desk, reviewing a new client proposal. Sunlight poured in through the large windows, bathing the room in a golden glow. A framed photo of his mother, Leona, sat beside his computer, a constant reminder of her unwavering support and the strength that had brought them to this moment. For Elijah, this wasn't just a business. It was a symbol of everything he and Leona had endured, a testament to the resilience that had defined their lives. He leaned back in his chair, letting the sense of accomplishment wash over him. Later that evening, Elijah and Leona sat together on the balcony of their apartment, sharing a quiet dinner. The view overlooked the city's skyline, twinkling lights stretching as far as the eye could see. "This is nice," Leona said, her voice soft. "I can't remember the last time we just enjoyed the moment." Elijah nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "It feels good to finally breathe, doesn't it? No more shadows. No more fear." Leona looked at her son, her heart swelling with pride. "You've come so far, Elijah. I always knew you would, but seeing it, living it, it's more than I ever dreamed." Elijah turned to her, his expression serious. "I couldn't have done it without you, Mom. Everything I am, everything I've built, it's because of you. You taught me to be strong, to keep going no matter what." Leona reached out, placing a hand on his. "And you've taught me just as much, Elijah. You showed me that it's never too late to fight for what's right, to reclaim your life from the pain of the past." Across town, Edward Sterling sat alone in a small apartment, a far cry from the sprawling mansion he had once called home. The polished surfaces and luxurious furniture were gone, replaced by a stark simplicity that mirrored his new reality. A stack of newspapers lay on the coffee table, their headlines a haunting reminder of his fall from grace. But it wasn't the loss of his position or the tarnishing of his name that weighed heaviest on him. It was the estrangement from his family and the irrevocable damage he had caused to Leona and Elijah. Edward picked up a pen and a piece of paper, his hand trembling slightly as he began to write. Words spilled onto the page, a mixture of apology and regret, but he knew they could never undo what had been done. Back at Carter Consulting, Elijah prepared for a speech he had been invited to give at a local community center. The event focused on inspiring young entrepreneurs, and Elijah had been asked to share his journey. As he stood backstage, he thought about everything that had led him here, the struggles, the sacrifices, the moments of doubt. But he also thought about the lessons he had learned along the way. When it was his turn, Elijah stepped onto the stage to warm applause. The room was filled with eager faces, their eyes full of hope and curiosity. "Good evening, everyone," he began, his voice steady and confident. "I want to start by sharing something personal with you, something that shaped the person I am today." He told them about Leona, about her strength and determination, and about the challenges they had faced together. He spoke of the moment he learned the truth about Edward Sterling and the decision to confront the man who had caused them so much pain. "But this story isn't about revenge," Elijah said, his voice softening. "It's about resilience. It's about choosing to rise above the darkness of your past and build something new, something better." After the event, Elijah and Leona walked through the quiet streets, the crisp night air wrapping around them. "That was a powerful speech," Leona said, linking her arm with his. "Thanks, Mom," Elijah replied. "I wanted people to see that no matter how hard things get, there's always a way forward." Leona nodded thoughtfully. "Do you think Edward ever found his way forward?" Elijah was silent for a moment, considering her question. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I've realized it doesn't matter. What matters is that we did." Days later, Elijah found a letter waiting for him at the office. The handwriting on the envelope was unfamiliar, but as he opened it, he realized who it was from. "Elijah, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I needed to write it. I've spent the past few months reflecting on everything I've done, on the pain I caused you and your mother. There are no excuses for my actions, and I won't insult you by offering any. But I want you to know that I regret every decision that hurt you both. I regret not being there for you and not being the father you deserved. You've shown me what true strength looks like, Elijah. The way you stood up to me, the way you've built your life, it's something I deeply admire. I don't expect forgiveness, but I hope you can find peace, knowing that you are far better than I ever was." Edward Sterling Elijah folded the letter carefully, his emotions a complicated mix of anger, sadness, and closure. He tucked it into his desk drawer, knowing it was a chapter of his life he was finally ready to close. The story of Elijah and Leona Carter is one of love, courage, and persistence. It's a reminder that the darkness of the past doesn't have to define you. They proved that resilience is a choice, one that requires strength and determination, but ultimately leads to freedom and peace. As Elijah often says when asked about his journey, never let the shadows of your past steal the light of your future. Stand tall, fight for what's right, and trust that the truth will always prevail. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this heartfelt story. We wish you a joyful and warm Christmas filled with love and happiness. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button to join us for more inspiring stories to come. See you in the next one.